and I am going to start recording our session today. I'd like to welcome you all. I'm just going to pull up my slides here to our Palliative Care Echo series for today, and we're talking about the culturally humble approach to palliative care. And we're very fortunate to have Rami Shami here with us today to speak. And I'm Stephanie Hendrickson. I'm the coordinator for the Northwest Regional Palliative Care Program, St. Joseph's Care Group Echo Hub site, which is part of the larger national Echo project led by Pallium Canada. We like to tell you a bit about the Echo project if you're not familiar with it. It is a 5-year national initiative. It will be ending its first 5 years coming up in March, hopeful for renewal because it's been a great initiative. And it is aimed to cultivate communities of practice to establish ongoing professional development among healthcare providers who care for people who could benefit from a palliative approach to care. And you can always visit Pallium Canada's Echo website where you'll find tons of upcoming sessions, and they are all free of charge. And just to note that the Palliative Care Echo project is supported by Health Canada. However, the views expressed in today's presentation do not necessarily represent the views of Health Canada. And while we're joining each other virtually today, as the host of this session, Lakehead University respectfully acknowledges its campuses are located on the traditional lands of Indigenous people. And Lakehead Thunder Bay is located on the traditional lands of the Fort William First Nation, which is signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. Lakehead University acknowledges the history that many nations hold in the areas around our campuses and is committed to a relationship with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit based on the principles of mutual trust, respect, reciprocity, and collaboration in the spirit of reconciliation. And as a center, we are committed to working towards reconciliation and decolonizing our work. And we've committed as a staff to educating ourselves in these areas, both personally and professionally. For myself, I've come to understand this as a process of learning, unlearning, and relearning, since much of my formal education, especially before university, was colonial in nature. So I do seek out opportunities to learn about and appreciate different ways of learning and knowing, and also prioritize ensuring my son is educated on the true history of this country we now call Canada. One of the quotes from the late Honorable Marie Sinclair that has been sticking with me lately is education got us into this mess and education will get us out. But as the TRC has taught us, it really isn't just about education, it's also about then taking action, such as fighting racism in the healthcare system, calling it out when we see it, and working towards more equitable access to palliative care and resources. So I would encourage those who haven't done so to take a look at the TRC Commission 94 Calls to Action and focus on an area that you might be passionate about as well. As we get into things here, we would love to know where you all are joining us from. If you want to put your name, your role into the chat box, please feel free to do that. Couple quick housekeeping items. Your microphone is muted throughout the presentation, but you're welcome to use the chat function to ask questions or add comments. If we do run out of time today, Rami has said we can definitely follow up afterwards with anything that might be outstanding. We'll ask you to do a quick evaluation at the end, and we are recording today and we can send this out to you within the next week. And Rami has also graciously offered to share his slide presentation with us today. So all that being said, I'm thrilled to be able to introduce Rami Shami, who has been serving within hospice palliative care for over 3 decades. He feels privileged to practice as a consultant in hospice palliative care, as well as case manager for the Second Mile Club at Kensington Health and the community relations advisor for Lighthouse for Grieving Children. While harvesting a conviction that everyone should have access to quality hospice palliative care, Rami strongly advocates and supports the development and growth of programs and services for those traveling the journey of a life-limiting illness, their caregivers, and those who are bereaved. So thank you very much once again for being here, Rami, and I will stop sharing my slides so you can take over from here.
Oh, thank you, Stephanie. All right, let's rock and roll. I really appreciate the perspectives that you provided on truth and reconciliation. Just to give you a quick, what it means to me in terms of even speaking of lang acknowledgement, is the fact that my parents are an immigrant and refugee. And when they came to this land, they had no idea. They came from war and genocide and murder and trauma, and they had no idea. They thought they were coming to a safe haven. And over the past 4 or 5 years, in the education and awareness and actionating the tenants, the calls to action, they were horrified to gain awareness and learn. Actually, a lot of it through my daughter, because she learns it in school, and I take her to powwows and sacred fires and what have you. She learned it. They learned it a lot from my daughter. What had actually transpired just in the consequence of us settling here. So yeah, very well said, Stephanie. All right, folks, welcome. I just want to give a bit of a shout out. I see you, Nina. I know you're there. You always come to my presentations. I love it. I hope one day we can connect again. And a little shout out to Harrison. He's doing he's just got accepted into his master's program at the University of Guelph. We will definitely connect, because if you're back again today to learn more about a culturally humble approach, I am so excited to meet with you and talk a little bit more, my friends. So good stuff. All right, folks, I do have some slides. We will share them definitely afterward. And I just have this practice that I like to share the slides after the presentation so we could just be present, right? Don't worry about taking notes. This is recorded. It'll be put on Echo website or wherever it might be housed. But I want to make this a bit engaging, because I feel culturally humble approach is really sweeping the nation in terms of grief and bereavement support, which I did yesterday with Bereaved Families of Ontario, which I'm very excited about, and today in an approach to palliative care. So I got a lot to share with you, and in a very short period of time, actually, but let's see how this will go, especially since I love to make things engaging and interactive. So what are we going to do today in the short time that we have together? I'm going to put the chat up, folks. So I hope this doesn't block anybody's view. Let me know if it does. And if you have questions, if you have comments, if some of the questions I might ask you and there's an answer to them, just throw them up in the chat. And this way we can keep the flow going. Because if we open the mic, we can be here for a while in terms of discussions and anecdotes and what have you. So today we're gonna explore what is a culturally humble approach. What is cultural humility? How does it differ from what I feel is the antiquated models of culture sensitivity and cultural competence? We're going to see how a culturally humble approach can be applied to the various domains of palliative care, from caregiver support to end of life, to grief and bereavement, to active dying, to time of diagnosis. And then we're going to speak to personal culture as it pertains to a culturally humble approach. I really feel, folks, if all the education and training we're receiving doesn't focus or have a focus or an element of cultural humility, and one of its pillars is personal culture, then how are we truly claiming to be person-centered? And I'm hoping today what I share with you can support that. All right, here we go. So, folks, this is where my parents come from. And this is the Middle East. My dad's from Israel. He's an Israeli, and my mom's Lebanese. Same religion, but just different countries of origin. And they still claim to be from those parts of the world. When they talk about back home, they don't talk about Canada. I talk about Canada because I was born and raised here. They talk about Israel and Lebanon. And it's a mess over there, as you can probably recognize. When they came here, they came with a lot of what's called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so my childhood was quite a little bit challenging from the aspects of racism with a name like Rami Shami. And then, some of the childhood developmental trauma I experienced from my parents, directly and indirectly in their experiences of trauma. And there's nobody that I know that could resonate and speak to trauma and trauma being trauma informed like this incredible lady. Does anybody recognize this who the lady is? I really hope so, folks. Because in my humble opinion, I think she's a Canadian legend, if not Canadian royalty. And I had the absolute privilege of meeting her and spending a few moments with her way back. I mean, this is maybe 25, 30 years ago. And she actually died couple weeks after that. And why I love showing this particular picture, folks, because that moment, if it didn't just define my career, it defined my life. I met this incredible lady, and it literally lasted maybe 45 seconds, maybe a minute. I was honored to receive the award, but it felt like an hour. And her power of holding space and being present. Yeah, thank you, Nina. Of course, Nina. Of course, Nina. holding space and being present was so potent that it made me feel like she was paying attention to me as if I was the only person in the world that mattered. She was that present. And even though she was making fun of my name, she said, Rami, Shami, what kind of name is that? Don't you have a middle name? I said, no, my parents were drunk when they named me. And she was making fun of, like my unibrow and all this, but there was a moment of presence, as if she saw all of me, or at least was open to experiencing all that I was in that particular moment in time and space. And that incredible lady is Miss June Caldwell. She established 50 social service organizations across Canada, including one famous one called Casey House, named after her son, who was killed by a drunk driver at the age of 17 while he was driving home around this time of year. Moving forward, I was just talking with Stephanie. It's awesome we have Zoom now. Well, we always had Zoom, but COVID kind of encouraged us gently to use it a lot more. But I used to do a lot more traveling across Canada and the States and Trinidad and what have you, to speak about hospice palliative care principles and practices. And I get often asked, where are you from? And I'm like, I'm Canadian. No, no, where are you really from? I'm like, no, I'm born and raised in Canada. And they say, okay, so what city you're from? And I say, Toronto. And it's almost as if on cue that if somebody hears I'm Canadian and somebody hears I'm from Toronto, they put me in the box that I'm a Leafs fan. I'm like, I don't even watch hockey. I don't like hockey. I've never played ice hockey. I don't care if the Leafs win the Stanley Cup, which you never will. It's not who I am. It's not part of what defines me. And so when they hear that, and I say, well, you know what, I'm not really into hockey, and I can't afford to even go to a Leafs game. They're like, so where are your parents from? I'm like, well, my parents are from Israel and Lebanon. And right away, it's almost as if everybody has a Lebanese friend. And once they hear Lebanon, right? Once they hear Lebanon, they're like, your food is great. I'm like, I wouldn't know. They're like, what do you mean? It's like, don't you like falafel? I'm like, nope, I have falafel trauma. I don't eat falafel. Okay. What about hummus? I'm like, you're not even saying it properly. It's hummus. And I don't like hummus. I like a beer and a Guinness and a cheeseburger and the fries on the side. That's what I like. And if you truly sat with me and asked me what my personal culture was, it's not Lebanese, Israeli, Canadian. It's not somebody who resonates with the Maple Leafs in Toronto and hockey. It's not somebody who even likes Lebanese food. I know that's blasphemous because people say, what? You don't like Lebanese food? I'm like, no, not really. If you were to sit with me and talk to me and ask me about how I identify and who I am from a culturally humble, personal cultural approach, I would tell you folks, I'm pure blood hospice palliative care. I've been doing this for 35 years. I've worked with 35, 30, maybe 40 different hospice palliative care organizations across the country, into the US, across the pond, down into Trinidad and Tobago. I mean, I like to say I bleed hospice, not necessarily the work, but the principles and practices of palliative care, which many of us are well versed in, but I'm so passionate because they've literally defined my life. And Stephanie, we're talking about, and May, we were talking about kids. My kid is so well versed in palliative care principles and practices that she actually got in trouble a couple of years ago in school because she was at school and she was talking in a classroom. The teacher overheard her. She was talking about, her name is Zemra. She's 13 going on 18. They overheard her talking about where she wanted to die and who she wanted to die with and where she wanted to be buried and what are some of the final things she wanted to say. And I got a frantic call from the teacher saying, is your child okay? Does she have mental health? Is she suicidal? Does she have suicidal? I'm like, why? She said, because she's talking about death. I'm like, no, that's part of the natural, normal progression of our lives. It should be taught respectfully in every school, almost at every kind of grade. And resorting back to my personal culture is how I shared and taught my child, really. I've seen a lot of death, a lot of celebration of life, a lot of joy, a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, which may not be necessarily the same thing, a lot of grief. And it's really infused who and what I am. But interestingly enough, until very recently, my family, my biological family, because I have an extended family of friends and pets, does not really align, even if I can say accept the work that I do. We're worlds apart when it comes to personal culture. But once again, if you were to look at me at an intake firm, or you were to actually talk to, the pieces that you might know about me, I'd be put in that box, and you'd never know who and what I was in my heart, right? And that's what I want to talk about in terms of a personal culture and a culture of humility today, is how to be a learner of who somebody is. I got the greatest job in the world, folks. I mean, I don't know how I landed here. I spent 19 years as a hospice volunteer, a hospice palliative care volunteer, going into people's homes, providing grief and bereavement support, sitting at end of life, providing caregiver support. And then somebody thought up in Barrie it was a good idea to give me a job in hospice palliative care, and I've never looked back, right? I love this work so much. And I've never felt I've approached in any measure of burnout. I've approached burnout in personal life, dealing with boards, navigating traffic in Toronto. If you folks have ever been across the 401 at 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon of a long weekend, but the work nourishes me, and I really thrived during COVID-19 because just somehow the practices of being trauma informed and culturally humble really safeguarded my well-being. So I run around all over the place doing a lot of education and knowledge sharing. I don't really believe in the term training or teaching. I believe in knowledge sharing. We always get the information from somewhere. And a lot of the information I've received and I've learned is from where I've traveled and spent time with people, like at Garrison, New York, or Zen Hospice Project in California. But a lot of it has been at bedside. A lot of it has been listening to people who are grieving, the challenges and suffering of people who are caregiving. So I work as a consultant, which is really cool stuff. But I also have two home bases. I work for Kensington Health as a case manager in our 19-bed hospice residence. We have two separate hospice residences where people come to die. We also have 350-bed long-term care facility, and we have a community program. And I get to work in those three demographics. So those three domains. So I work in the hospice residence, I work in the long-term care, and I work in the community. I provide caregiver support and I provide grief and bereavement support, which is an amazing continuum because so much of grief and anticipatory loss happens before somebody's died. And I get to support and journey with people from time of diagnosis into caregiving, into end of life, into grief and bereavement, and on they go. I also work for Lighthouse for Grieving Children, which is a peer supported by groups, grief support for children, teens, and youth and their families who've experienced a death-related loss. A lot of my work as well, folks, is working with people experiencing homelessness or being unhoused. So not the homeless, okay? It's not to classify people by their housing situation or their home situation, and who are living with a life-limiting illness, usually a progressive life-limiting illness, which is a very unique aspect of personal culture. I helped open one of the first hospices that served people experiencing homelessness, which was Journey Home Hospice, which is amazing because I worked there for a year before I transitioned to Kensington Health. And why I'm sharing this all with you folks is because you'll see how it relates to culture, humility, and personal culture. I also had the good fortune of helping to open a palliative care unit in Cora Province in Trinidad and Tobago. I spent 3 or 4 years going down there. And it was opened by Mr. Sati Simango in honor of his daughter, Trudy Ann, who had died of breast cancer at the age of 44. And I just wanted to show you this picture quickly, right? I remember standing there way back, I think it was 2018, 2017. I helped, knowledge share and train a lot of the staff and volunteers. We had a volunteer program, a fulsome volunteer program, a day hospice, and we're just about to do a grief and bereavement program when COVID hit. I remember standing there with Mr. Sati Simango, and there's people sitting underneath that tree. And I said to Mr. Simango, I said, sir, what do you think those people are doing there underneath that tree? And he says to me in his perfect Trinidadian accent, his beautiful velvety Trinidadian accent, which I won't ever try to emulate. He says to me, Rami, that's the tree of life. And people are sitting on there, are families of, people who are dying with us, their staff, their volunteers that you trained, their staff that you trained. They're sitting there contemplating life and death. And I thought to myself, how poetic is that? Of the natural progression of the tree of life and reflection and recognition and awareness of the impact of anticipatory loss and palliation and suffering and death and dying. And the words that really stuck out for me was the reflection. And a strong part, you'll see when I share with you, a strong aspect of a culturally humble approach is that reflection, is that self-reflection. Moving on, folks, I just want to put this out there. Take whatever of this works for you, leave the rest. I'm not a social worker. I'm not a nurse. I'm not a physician. I'm not educated beyond a human biology degree from University of Toronto. Almost everything I've learned has been at the bedside, as I mentioned, or in courses and programs, or in conversations and books and resources, which I'll share with Echo. when I provide these slides, I provide you an exhaustive list of materials, but just take what works for you. Culture humility is certainly not my own, and you'll see where nobody really knows, or maybe they do, I don't know where it's originated from, but I know it's where it's been championed from. So let me ask you quickly, how do you define culture? Any thoughts? Can we just make this a little interactive? Can we just throw it out there? How do you define culture? What do you say is culture? What's your thoughts? Trish says traditions. Laura says your habits, customs, feelings, beliefs, way of living. Janet says your upbringing. Robin says practices that are important to you. I hear a lot of individuality in there. Good. Anything else? Well, folks, your past experiences, yeah, Jessica, let's temper that one because I want to speak about, the aspects of trauma as it pertains and influences and even shapes our personal culture. Trish continues on our environment. No doubt our environment. April speaks to a belonging. RL speaks to how I grew up, conditioned by family, education, experiences. And the important word there, I feel, RL, is the conditioning. So much of who and what we are is conditioning. I mean, I was just talking to Stephanie about social media and phones, like how much of that is influencing consciously or unconsciously or subconsciously who and what we are. Jessica goes on and says education. I think education is a big piece of influencing who and what we are. Jacqueline says, lived experience, no doubt, right? That's my life, Jacqueline. My personal culture, who and what I am, has so much to do with death care, death and bereavement care. Okay. And Melanie also adds, as also influenced by faith and belief. And that's an interesting point because my father is a minister of our religion, but I don't subscribe to our religion at all, really, in many ways. But it's interesting how it can influence how we perceive the world. But folks, a textbook definition, if you ask, sure, Shannon, values, beliefs, and as personhood. I really appreciate that you said personhood. Okay. We talk about culture so often. Here's a definition, a textbook definition that we hear. The set of shared attitudes, values, goals, beliefs, and practices that characterizes an institution, an organization, or a group. But what's missing there? I mean, every time we talk about culture, you hear the sharing, the institution, the organization, the community, the group. What's missing there? Yeah, for sure. The individual. Yes, Laura. Janet, absolutely. Right? Jessica, the individual, the intersectionality. But folks, whenever, I mean, I just did a few years ago on education just to see what it was like about the whole culture piece from one of the big hospitals. And they constantly group culture into a group, to a collective. Yeah, we can be part of that collective, but we have a sense of personhood, as Shannon mentioned, in that collective. And nowhere is that more pronounced and obvious than in palliative care. When we've been diagnosed, when we are experiencing anticipatory loss, when we're caring for somebody who's living with a life-limiting illness, progressive or not, when they are dying, when we are grieving, we are expressing aspects of our own personhood. Even the reflective practice of mortality draws from us our personhood. And I think what resonates so strongly with me from a trauma-informed approach, because I've experienced considerable trauma, is the whole aspect of autonomy, of identifying who and what we are as distinct and separate from others, especially in a collective, in a group, or as Jessica mentioned, in the intersectionality of it with that group. But I'm still a person. And I feel death care, and specifically palliative care, really emphasizes that autonomous sharing and teaching of who and what I am. I mean, that's the whole, movement of pronouns even, right? In any case, there's still a lot of education and I feel misinformation and misdirection of what it is to have personhood, especially as it relates to culture. Right now, there's so much. Thank you, Allison. Living a good life and learning how we are in relation with others, including things around us, using our beliefs to live. Yeah, no doubt. Absolutely. There's still these aspects of culture sensitivity, cultural competence, and what I'm a strong proponent and a champion of is culture humility. And today I'm going to kind of differentiate them because there are distinct differences, even though they seem to be the same thing. And a lot of the education training we're doing nowadays, or knowledge sharing, comes from the how can I say, the posture of being ethnocentric. I mean, folks, when I started in hospice palliative care, um, what, 35, 36 years ago, we were very anthrocentric. I mean, I looked around my room where I was training, and it was very unique. The mono demographic of people that were there, and the way it was expressed of how palliative care was, you know, provided. Right? It's in many ways, it's a European colonial model. We've modified it here, but in many ways it is, right? It was sort of championed by Dame Cicely Saunders, and you know, taught and exercised here in ways that were not necessarily trauma informed, and were not necessarily culturally humble or anti-oppressive or harm reduced. But it's very changing very much right now. But where palliative care came from is oftentimes in this inherent feeling that how I do things is the way things are done, like a bit of a superiority, if not a judgment, that the way others do things and are not necessarily up to par of how I do them. If you don't have to go far and back in history of palliative care to recognize that. And because I mean, 20, 30, 40 years ago, it's only a small population of people that got palliative care. And if we didn't fall into that, and above that, the diversity of peoples that were seeking palliative care, you didn't have access to it. And even today, the focus of palliative care is accessibility. The whole presentation today about personal culture, personhood, and culture humility is about accessibility. It's about accessibility to palliative care services that align with a person's sense of personhood. And even if we look at a sense of personhood, it's fascinating today, folks. I did some work this past summer with an amazing organization called Camp Kirk up in, where was it? Anyways, it's out of GTA. Once we're out of the GTA, I lose sight of everything. Anyways, with Camp Kirk, and their focus is neurodiversity, right? And that's such a marginalized aspect of palliative care. When we talk about diversity, we talk about culture, we didn't even look at how we express ourselves in these basic human properties. Like, of course, our values and our quote unquote norms, but that's kind of a misdirection, right? What is a norm if we really look at personhood? And if we look at from a trauma-informed perspective of self and space, how we hold space or how we feel people are in our space, that's definitely part of our personal culture. You can take two people who have this similar faith and similar religion and gender identity and religion. Did I say religion? And even like the same food, hummus or falafel, right? And all these aspects, same education. If one has experienced traumatization while the other hasn't, they will have a different personhood around space, how you touch them, how you step into their environment, and even the way we communicate. My kid has dysgraphia. Her communication is very unique and different from everybody else in her class, including dress and appearance, like the whole aspect of how we want to be presented. I have Crohn's disease. Most of the food out there I can't eat. Ironically, I could still have a Guinness and a beer every once in a while, but even part of my personhood is determined by the disease that I've been living with since I was 8 months old. It's become part of my personal culture, and it actually has a name, which is kind of silly, but I call it George. My Crohn's is George, right? And even in time and time consciousness, as time expands and contracts in our relation to, our upbringing, but also our experiences of life and our experiences of traumatization and how we define family. We used to define, I remember, when I first started in hospice palliative care 35, 36 years ago, we got a manual and said, this is how we do family. Family's mom and dad, maybe a boy, girl, kids, maybe a dog or a cat, nuclear. But how do we define family nowadays? I love working with people experiencing homelessness or being unhoused because the whole definition of families can be very different, right? And then, of course, our beliefs and our attitudes, which are really influenced a great deal by social media, by the internet, we're on our fingertips. We have access to so much information. And a lot of that happens subversive, unconscious. Our mental processing. Because of my experiences of traumatization, I realized after studying and reading the great book by Dr. Bruce Perry called The Boy is Raised as a Dog, that my mental processing should have been diagnosed as ADHD. Okay. And yet it's still a misdiagnosis because it's my nervous system being active all the time because of my experiences of traumatization. And that brings us to work habits and attitudes, and even when we were talking about Zoom and hybrid models and, and different working hours, those all play into how we express our sense of personhood or personal culture, and then necessitate a model that can exercise that accessibility. That's cultural humility. So let's get into a little bit of the background. All right. Anybody done any cultural sensitivity training? I don't mean like today, because now it's convoluted. They're pretending it's cultural sensitivity when it's actually cultural humility. Or has anybody done any cultural sensitivity training or cultural competence? How many of you have? Well, I'll give you a little bit of a definition. You might recognize this. Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Jill and Jacqueline. Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah. So, I did cultural sensitivity training way back in the day, and this is kind of the definition, right? That speaks to cultural sensitivity. It means being aware, and check out, the language. It means being aware of cultural differences. Like, what does that mean, right? If we all have this unique personhood that I think Shannon said, of intersectionality with other aspects of, ritual and ceremony and culture, and we express it in our own unique way, how can you have a generalized cultural difference? Anyway, so cultural differences and similarities exist, have an effect on values, learning, and behavior. Well, good definition. Of course, that's way back in 1997, right? But cultural sensitivity, the way it's being taught, or I feel, or the way it's been exercised and brought forth, fails to recognize that personal culture is multi-layered and is tied to identity. And it's also what's missing about it, which I love about palliative care, is the fact there's an autonomy and a self-direction in that can determine what I resonate with within the larger context of a culture. Okay. So I can pick and choose certain aspects of a religion or a ritual or a culture and align with it because I believe in it, but it's not necessarily the generalized culture of a people's. So when people hear I'm Lebanese Israeli, like, wait a minute, what are you, right? Well, I say I'm Canadian, but I attend sacred fires. I go to temple on Diwali. I go to, on during Hanukkah, I sit with a rabbi. Like there's all these aspects, right? Ramadan, I'll fast for a little while in how it identifies with me, because my expression or intersectionality with those aspects of cultures really fields my identity. Because oftentimes also, folks, we stereotype people. Oh, all those people do that. All women who wear hijab don't shake a man's hand, right? Or all those people are of that kind of behavior. And we even use the term those people. You've heard it in the media and what have you. And it leads to power dynamics because it's other focused. Did you hear, like, I am sensitive to other people's cultural differences? It's other focused. And you might ask, what's the challenge with that? What's the issue with that? Well, when we're other focused, we're seeing the difference in someone else, not giving acknowledgement that they may be seeing us just as different or similar as we see them. It's focused one way. That's the ethnocentrism. That's the superiority. I see you. I don't recognize that you also see me. Okay. Anyways, and that moved us in a way to something called cultural competence. Oh, that's great to hear, Laura. And when I started in hospice palliative care, again, many moons ago, many years ago, I got a manual, literally a manual about culture. And it literally said on it, this is culture. I'm like, wow, I think back now. And in it, folks, they literally said, this is how Jews do death. This is how Muslims do death. This is how Christians do death. This is how Hindus do death. They didn't even include Punjabis and what have you, or Jain. And they didn't even have indigenous peoples in there, indigenous nations. They didn't have 2S LGBT plus. They just had a competence model. They said, hey, when you go to people's homes and we tell you they're of this denomination or this religion or this ritual or this culture, check it out in the manual. Then you'll have some information when you go in. I'm like, how biased is that? That puts blinders on me. And I'm not in a position where I can receive from the person what they intersect with and what they don't. Because there's no necessarily an efficiency to culture. There's a personhood to it. There's a personal expression to it, right? And that's why a lot of cultural competence leads to stereotyping. I'm not saying, that I feel, folks, when I hear somebody is of a particular sect, religion, faith, spirituality, I receive from them what they want to share with me, because sometimes they're angry at that deity, because sometimes it's however their family, chosen, found, or biological, that is imprinted that on me or on them. And they don't want anything to do with it. The beauty of palliative care is that if we focus on that autonomy and self-expression, I find people can truly be who and what they are, an authentic expression of self. Anyways, a lot of cultural competence moments literally lead to stereotyping. I get asked all the time, do people who are homeless or unhoused have a culture? I'm like, no. You can't put them all in a box. Often people say, yeah, they do. They're like resilient and they know how to survive. And I'm like, well, not everybody. Some of them are struggling. Some of them are trying to get off the streets. Some of them are living rough. Some of them aren't even on the streets. They're living, by couch surfing, right? That's a form of homelessness. And then if you really want to look at it, check out the work of Jesse Thistle. He does some amazing work. He did his whole master's thesis on this. He wrote a book called From the Ashes. I used to teach with him and now he blew up and he's just awesome. He wrote a book called From the Ashes about his story. He's Indigenous Métis. And he published his thesis about the Indigenous definition of homelessness, not the Canadian definition, the Indigenous definition of homelessness. Now, if you look at that from a personal culture aspect, you see how we can stereotype people and put them in boxes? And it leads to this categorization. I think we categorize people in healthcare, maybe not as much in palliative care, but I've seen it, right? I think we categorize people to think that we're making our job easier and that we're being person-centered when we're not. We're being assumptive. And it's a static model. And I'll tell you why it's a static model, because the reflective practice of dying, the reflective practice of living with a life-limiting illness and the anticipatory loss and the grief and the trauma of it changes who we are as we journey through that illness, as we die of that illness, as we grieve of the person who died of that illness. Our identity, our personhood, our personal culture changes as a result, even at the time of diagnosis, how we perceive ourselves. You know how many people in the caregiver support that I provide say, you know what, I'm no longer a husband or a wife or a partner. I'm a free PSW. That becomes a part of their how they identify themselves, right or wrong, good or bad. It's irrelevant. It's how they autonomously identify themselves, how they feel, and changes how I provide care for them. It's fascinating, folks. And this is where I work and play. I work in this place where not knowing all the answers. And I'll tell you, folks, sometimes people push back. I do a lot of this knowledge sharing and education about culturally humble, trauma-informed harm reduction practices. They're like, well, are you burdening people by asking them questions? I'm like, no, actually, that's never, ever, I've never experienced that in 30 years. It's the autonomy that they share what they want and how they want to be cared for, how they want to be identified, how they want to be supported as a distinct individual. And for people who are living with a life-limiting illness and a palliative approach, that the illness is taken away so much of who and what they are. They're losing aspects of their identity as they're living with this illness, or they're caring for somebody living with this illness. It changes how they even would express what you would classify or characterize as a culture. And that's why we frame it in culture humility as personal culture. And that's why, folks, I'm a very strong proponent and supporter of cultural humility, right? It's been around for a long time, but now it's really powerful because I think we're really focusing more on personhood, personal identity, choice, autonomy, choice to tell you who and what I am here and now, which can change tomorrow if I can't walk anymore, if I can't get out of bed, if I can't have sex, I can't go do the activities I love to do because I have to be at home caregiving a lot. I'm an informal and formal caregiver as well, folks. I care for my mom and dad. My dad has a congestive heart failure. My mom has an inoperable tumor in her neck. So my plate is full, right? Plus a kid, right? And my job that I absolutely love. So part of my identity has become a caregiver. You won't see that on a definition of culture. And folks, let me tell you something. I'm not making this stuff up and I'm not pulling this out of thin air. You don't believe me? Check out the definition by the First Nations Health Authority, which I feel has the best definition of cultural humility out there. They have an amazing website. It's called #ItStartsWithMe, creating a climate for change. Do you notice that? Look at that hashtag. And you'll see why that is so important, that hashtag, it starts with me. All right. Because from a culturally competent perspective and a culturally sensitive perspective, it doesn't start with me. It starts with the other. So check out this definition. Cultural humility is a process of self-reflection to understand personal and systemic biases and to develop and maintain respectful processes and relationships based on mutual trust. Cultural humility involves humbly acknowledging oneself as a learner when it comes to understanding another's experience. Their work, in my humble opinion, is fantastic. It's brilliant. It's progressive. They have a great learning as well about trauma-informed care and about cultural safety. If you have any interest, check out their website. But let me ask you, what stands out for you there? In this definition of cultural humility, as exemplified by the First Nations Health Authority, what stands out for you? Let's see what you folks got. Sasha, is that like the Sasha Hill? I hope it is you. RL says, to me, the word humility carries a sense of open heart, willingness to learn, and a curiosity. Yes. Hello, Sasha. Good to see you. Or good to be with you, let's say. Towards a fellow human being as a distinct individual. Now check that out, what RL says. I'm sorry, I'm saying RL because I don't know really what your name might be. It might be RL. Or if it's short term, but RL, I would just temper the curiosity, because the curiosity for me has gotten me in trouble sometimes. My curiosity is, how am I going to be a learner to somebody else? But I'm mindful of that because I don't want my curiosity to guide the questioning and the learning. So I remember sitting with one gentleman who was on the beaches of Normandy, and he was dying with us. And he kept saying to me, why am I not dying with the beaches there and the bullets buzzing by my head? And my mind was like, wow, what was that like? Like, some of my friends have dads that, and parents, what have you, that died there. And I had to temper that because that's not what he wanted to focus on. He didn't want to focus on his military service and being on the beaches, on Juno Beach. He wanted to focus on what was it like to die here. So my curiosity had to be tempered with learning who he was here and now. Laura says mutual trust. Absolutely. Mutual. Okay. And especially in working in populations that experience marginalization, traumatization, isolation, that aspect of trust is really important, because you don't necessarily have to be trusted to be able to provide care. Janet says, acknowledging oneself as a learning and understanding another. Beautifully said, Janet. That's the whole thing. It's acknowledging ourselves as a learner. And if we are in a state of being a learner, we are automatically in a humble approach. And when I'm a learner to somebody else, it doesn't mean that we're not going to do anything to do with their rituals and ceremonies. It means they're going to show us. They're going to teach us what's relevant to them. Often I used to work in an amazing organization called Dorothy Lay Hospice here in Etobicoke, and we'd have customs and rituals and smudging and everything, but it was directed by the people. And sometimes people would come to us, and the families, however the families were defined, they're like, can you do this for us? But when we talk to the individual, like, I don't want any part in that. The person that's in the bed in the residence says, I don't want any part of that. That's not who I am. So it's very important for us to receive from the person how they want to do this. Who are they? What's relevant to them? And to be nimble enough to dance with it, because it could change tomorrow or the day after, depending what they're experiencing in terms of loss, in terms of their identity, in terms of what's meaningful to them. That's why personal culture is so important. Who are you today, here and now? Because it might change tomorrow and the day after and the day after, especially in a palliative approach, where we're constantly losing things, right? If I couldn't mountain bike, if I couldn't rock climb, if I couldn't dance with my daughter, if I couldn't, go out with my friends, if I couldn't do hospice, there's a change in who and what I am and how I see myself. And that's an important aspect of personal culture. Michelle says, all the words are spot on and brilliant. I agree. And I'll temper that as well. Michelle, I love your exclamations. You got 3 in there. So that's quite potent. I've never been in a place, folks, where I truly understand another's experience. I acknowledge it. I affirm. I learned this in being trauma informed. I can appreciate it, recognize it, resonate with it, empathize and compassionate, acknowledge and affirm it, but I've never truly understood it, because it lives up here. And my understanding has this veil of my own ego and personality and my experiences of traumatization. So I would say I acknowledge and affirm and recognize other people's experiences. But other than that, I love this definition. The other thing I just wanted to point out, folks, look what they say. We have personal biases. Our life changes even the way our brains think, of course, right? And so we have personal biases that influence how we perceive others, how we can help them. We have systemic biases. I mean, you look at a lot of the palliative care units and hospice residents, how many of them have bariatric beds, right? And you look at systemic bias, we have systemic biases in how we provide care. And if you don't, you want to strand that, just look at near north in Ontario. How long does it take for a nurse to get from one client or one patient to another? There's a lot of biases in that, but it's the hope with this approach that we can be a learner to someone, however they define themselves and divide their community and their family and their circle, and be able to provide a more person-centered approach. I get fired up about this stuff. I apologize, folks. Well, I do and I don't. I get so energetic about it. Some great research was done by these amazing individuals way back in 1998. And they actually said the versus, because they felt there is a versus. There is no culture, there's no competence in culture humility. The only competence is being a learner. Take what you receive from people, ask the important questions with compassion and empathy, and then act on what they provide for you in caring for them. Maybe this doesn't work in the general context of the world, but it works in palliative care. And at least I feel I can speak to that after a few years in this field. RL says, thanks for the feedback here. I really appreciate that. My name is, Rita. Okay, Rita. Evergreen. Yeah, welcome, Rita. I'm sorry, I don't have to change my name. No worries, Rita. And now I know who you are. Welcome from Evergreen. So culture humility, folks, it begins with us. It's about a two-way dynamic relationship, a relationship between two potentially very different perspectives. And I love this aspect. It's a process, a lifelong process and commitment to self-reflection, self-critique, and self-awareness. Folks, I'm constantly self-reflecting and how the work changes me. How does being in palliative care, being in grief and bereavement, being in caregiver support, being in the midst of suffering and joy and trauma every day, how does that change me? How does that evolve me? And it started, really, a lot of it by being in the presence, just in the presence of Miss June Caldwood. Like her sheer presence changed my personal culture. Culture humility is a philosophy. It's an approach. It's a tool, but it's not to be mastered. There's nothing to master. The mastery is really maybe the humility and learning how to be a learner, learning how to, it's so easy for us nowadays, folks. What do? We want to know something, Google it, right? It's at our fingertips. But to be in a place of the unknown, actually the best way I've heard it said, in the not known, not necessarily the unknown, the not known. The unknown means maybe there isn't any information. The not known means there's a possibility of learning, right? I love this characterization by Dr. Like. He had a lot of great work, and he says the essence of cultural competence, as he puts it in quotations, is culture humility. Having the people we serve teach us what's relevant to them means an awareness of our own beliefs, our own biases, and our own values. It's a matter of taking our own pulse. And you know why he puts that last line in there? It's a matter of taking our own pulse, folks. It's because what does our pulse do? For the clinicians out there, it constantly changes depending on our environment. Somebody mentioned the environment. It changes according to our environment. We change. So when he's saying matter of taking our own pulse, we have to recognize that the environment could be even changing who and what we are and determining that. And that's why it's a dance. That's why there's a dynamics to it. There's an intersectionality that's constantly changing. The people I serve, I don't assume it's the same person I'm talking to on the phone, on Zoom, or I'm being present with day in and day out. I'm providing care now for a family that one of the individuals has a brain tumor, is dying of brain tumor. Parents and child are diagnosed with neurodiversity. And to watch their year-long progression through this illness and how they've changed and evolved and suffered and morphed and grieved, man, you can't put them in a box. They're constantly changing. And nowhere do I see that change more happening than palliative care. It's almost as if living with a life-limiting illness, grieving as a result, anticipatory loss, caregiving for someone catalyzes our change in our personal culture. Culture humility asks us as providers to engage in self-reflection, self-critique, recognize and bring imbalances of power in check. When we are a learner, automatically we are in a different even state, different posture, different mindset. That changes the power balances, right? Rather than I know about you, I would like to learn, if you so choose, to teach me who you are and what you are and how you feel and what you think here and now. Assess the cultural dimensions of each individual anew. The anew part speaks to the dynamic nature of our changing personal culture today, tomorrow, or in the same day. Relinquish the role of the expert to the individual, become their student. Right? And that's the purest form of autonomy in palliative care. And recognize each individual ability to be a capable and full partner in the therapeutic relationship and the plan of care for the clinicians out there. Because we all have personal culture, folks. And in that personal culture, it impacts how we think, how we feel, how we behave, how we interact, even how we have biases and judgments about the world around us, let alone the people we are providing care for, let alone the people we are providing care with. I love this depiction, folks, because I truly believe if we aren't aware of our personal culture, we don't recognize that everywhere we step, metaphorically and practically, we create a ripple. Our personal culture goes wherever we are. And somehow, somatically, I learned this from a trauma-informed approach, somehow, somatically, it touches somebody else. On some level of potency, it does, right? And that's an awareness and a self-reflection of our personal culture as it's impacted by life, by loss, by trauma, by environment, by world events, okay? And if that's not enough, if we really look at Canada, I mean, we have a very troubling history in Canada, but right now, the measures of immigration and refugees coming to our country to make palliative care accessible, we almost are demanded of to be learners, right? And not just learners so we could provide better care and it's more accessible, but maybe we can learn how to do things differently. I love the Day of the Dead, Mexican Day of the Dead. We learned so much of that. I love attending sacred files and indigenous rituals and ceremonies because it teaches me a little bit differently about life and death. And folks, look at all the influences we have, all the influences that really, change who and what we are. I mean, I could ask you all, who's an iPhone user and who's a Android user? If you'll admit it, you're an Android user. And within Android, all the different companies providing Android, there's two cultures there because they're sold very differently, right? Apple has a very unique culture that they sell their product with. But are you proud of? I love it, Trish. Cool. Granted, granted. But even then, we are all unique and different, right? In that way, in that greater idea of a culture. But look at the music we listen to, how it influences. Look at social media. Social media is one of the greatest and biggest and most powerful influencers and determinants of who and what we are. Consciously, or we all know, the research shows that it does it also unconsciously, all right? Even the education, somebody mentioned education of how we are morphed and how we learn, how it expands our minds or constricts our minds if the education is less anti-oppressive and anti-racist. Look at the news, online streaming, the movies we watch, that we get to binge watch, even, the foods we necessarily eat and how it impacts our bodies, gluten-free or non-gluten-free or dairy-free, even celebrities, folks. I mean, what they were saying about my kid's not a Swiftie, but all the power to her. She pulled in $3 billion across the world, Taylor Swift. But look at how her way of living, who she is, how she influences the people that listen to her and listen to her music, right? Good, bad, right or wrong. I'm not interested. Just the influence. Or sports figures, especially, or celebrities when they have less than stellar, behavior, right? Or even how marketing is geared to influence our personal culture, even the way we dress and our clothes. The social justice movement, a lot of social justice has a personal culture to it of who aligns with that personal justice, right? I'm torn right now, right? Because I have people all over the Middle East, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, like all that whole area, right? And I'm torn because I get bombarded with, no, you got to think this way and you got to think this way and you got to, by these social justice movements. And I love living here because I can step back a little bit and see it hopefully from a less subjective approach. There's even climate change in world history, all these influences. And of course, religion and faith and all that, but look at all the influences that determine even how we perceive the world and how we feel about ourselves. And then those people come to die with us, right? And folks, one of the most diversifying aspects of our being, of our personhood, I really feel is trauma. And if I may build a case for you, I mean, when we talk about culture and personal culture, when we talk about diversity, I really feel we got to include trauma. Does anybody think, what do you think is is the percentage of Canadians who have experienced at least one traumatizing event in our lives. What do you think it is? What'd you throw a number out there as? Laura says 80%, Trish 95, 80. Okay, you know, Amna says 100, Michelle says 100, Allison says 90. Folks, I think it's over 100. It's 100%. If you look at how trauma impacts us from COVID-19, okay? If you look at the intergenerational aspect of trauma that it's passed down through our DNA, if you look at the impact of racism or gender specificity or even colonialism, or if you identify as LGBT plus to S plus, or even an accessibility with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities or neurodiversity or child maltreatment, which was my life, you know, childhood developmental trauma, or domestic violence, which is an all-time high during COVID-19, or war all over the world, or even my kid's school was shut down, i.e. quiet hallways, 4 times in 1 month last year because of school and community violence, or medical trauma. I almost died a couple of years because I have Crohn's and a bowel obstruction and they didn't do it right and cut me open. Anyways, medical trauma, or even living one night a street in the streets of a city or a town, or sexual assault with the Me Too movement, or many of us have experienced accidents, bike accidents, car accidents, or the plight of immigrants and refugees, or the impact of loss, not necessarily death related. And if that wasn't all enough to affect us in a traumatizing manner and change our sense of personhood and perception of the world, then there's climate change. I mean, it's 10 degrees outside and here in Toronto. I was just talking about that with Stephanie. Like, what? You know, we're going to have a green Christmas and if you celebrate Christmas. That is an aspect of, even whether we want to or not, like it or not, aware of it or not, impacts our sense of personhood and sense of self. And these are the people we're providing care for. And I want to go back to Ms. June Callwood. Just a little bit of a background. I don't feel anybody was as trauma informed really as her. She was really something else in that regard. When she died, she didn't want a funeral. And she had an amazing interview with George Stroumboulopoulos. And I shouldn't say that. I say that because of my name, Rami Shami. So George is going to one day walk in and say, hey, man, stop making fun of my name. I'm just, yeah. Anyways, he was an incredible interviewer before he went and did his Hockey Night in Canada thing. And if you watch this interview that he has with Miss June Callwood, the late Miss June Callwood, it is absolutely brilliant. He is a master at his craft. It's on YouTube. Check it out. George Stroumboulopoulos with June Callwood, last interview. And you'll see how he hunkers down and comes almost underneath the radar in a truly learner sense, in a truly, you know, humble sense, as he's learning about June and Miss Callwood and her life and her story. And it's so interesting because, folks, she tells him who she is and what's important to her, almost as if he doesn't have to ask, although he does. And some of the ways she answers those questions really indicate her personal culture. He starts to try to talk to her about, you know, religion and God and afterlife and all that, and she shuts him down in her autonomy, because she was quite a powerhouse, shuts him down and says, I believe in kindness. So part of her personal culture, and then goes on to explain what that means to her. Part of her personal culture, if I dare say her spirituality, was her definition of kindness. And the fact that she didn't want a funeral, and the fact that she was extremely independent, even though George says, hey, you've lived this life. You're a dignitary. You're royalty almost in Canada. Why don't you want a funeral? And she's like, you know, I wish I was more humble, but I've lived my life like this. That was pure cultural humility, culturally humble approach by George. And that was beautifully expressed as personal culture by June. Check it out, folks. I mean, you could basically teach this whole session with that one interview. Just to add to that, folks, to talk about personal culture and identity and all that. So people were upset that she didn't have a funeral, or just felt they couldn't mourn, right, in a way that's traditional and customary. So they got together, and I think they pulled 52 stories of kind acts by Miss June Callwood, and they wrote a book about her, and they said it's all about kindness. So from that one interview about her personal culture and what her values were from a kindness perspective, they created this act of mourning. It's beautiful. It's so synchronous. It's so intersectional. If we have the awareness and even intentionality of being a learner. And George is a master at it. So circling back around, folks, how do we practice culture? Let's get to the practical aspects of how do we practice culture humility. Once again, to reiterate, it's a philosophy, it's an approach. It's not to be mastered. When we don't know much about a person's culture, personal culture, we admit it to ourselves. We ask to be educated about using the teach me method if they so choose to share. I can't tell you how many times folks, people say, I'm okay. Just whatever. Like not much I want to share. Or they share that their name isn't what it is on the intake form. They change their name. They express a different gender. They express a different identity, right? They come out. Or in aspects of dementia and Alzheimer's, they come back to who they identified as before they were diagnosed. So many people like the opportunity to express themselves while leave it to their autonomy to choose if they don't so. Folks, let me ask you a quick question. Oh, all the best, Valerie. Thank you for coming with us. Let me ask you a quick question. What is the most common fear people have, anecdotally, but also said by a lot of great teachers and educators in death care? What is the most common fear people have when they are dying? What do you think the most common fear is? What are some of the most David Letterman's top 10? Anybody remember David Letterman? Trish says pain. Yeah, top 10 for sure. Being alone, yeah. Dying alone, yeah. Sort of, Trish. I mean, a lot of people, I feel, wait until everybody's left the room before they die. Sure, yeah. Jacqueline says the unknown, yeah. The afterlife, the unknown, what's going to happen to them. Worried about their loved ones, losing their identity. Yeah, Laura, for sure. Leaving loved ones, however that's. Sasha says pain. I'm sure you've seen that a lot. And Rita says being forgotten. Folks, I can't tell you how often I've seen that, heard it, experienced it from people, and learned from other dignitaries in the field. And says being sad unnecessarily, yeah, but being forgotten. The whole aspect is there's something of me that carries on after I'm gone that you're going to remember. That's such an important aspect of it. And that's why I find so many people I have the complete honor and privilege of, supporting through a palliative approach and into grief and bereavement, want to teach me who they are because they don't want to be forgotten. So it's almost a shoe-in. All I have to do, I don't have to watch Netflix and binge watch Netflix or, learn about the Kardashians or anything like. I just sit and learn from people who and what they are. I relinquish the role of the expert to them and I become their student in the light, in the spirit of not being forgotten. I've heard some incredible stories, even close to death. Like it doesn't mean that they have to be with us for months and years. But I'm also aware of my own personal culture, how it serves as the backdrop to perceiving another person's personal culture. That's why we have to be self-reflected. We have to be self-reflected to see how much of me is influencing who I'm caring for. And I listen with my body, I listen with my heart, I listen with my mind, I listen with my ears, but it's a whole totality, a holistic way of listening. And some of the practices I ask myself, how self-reflective am I? What's my own personal culture here and now that might change tomorrow, the day after, or next year? I mean, part of my personal culture was being sick a couple of years ago and being sick last year and being hospitalized with a bowel obstruction. That's part of my story. My experience of childhood developmental trauma. It's part of my story. It isn't falafel and hummus, okay? It's my experience of traumatization. It's my life in hospice. My values and beliefs are based on those aspects. Even my activators, my sensitivities, my biases are part of my personal culture that's built on my life. That if I have the privilege of having any of you provide me a palliative approach when I'm living with a life-limiting illness, you'll hear about it because I mean, that's why I'm doing this, right? To share that. And being in a state of humility not only allows us to bring power and balance into check, but also allows us to support others in the way that respects their individuality and their process. And the tools we have, folks, the most valuable tool is our genuine selves. And if we want to talk about our genuine, authentic selves, there has to be a certain amount of knowledge of our own personal culture. I cultivate my sense of not knowing the answers when I care for people and having them taught to me. Especially, I'm very privileged, folks, because I have time with people. I know we don't always have time, but I don't think you always need time. Like we really think we have to sit for hours with somebody to learn who and what. No, sometimes it's the way they look, the way they move, the way they interact with you. There's so much information that goes unsaid. Because right now, folks, in palliative care and receiving a palliative approach, we're at an intersection. We're really in an intersection. And that intersection is, how are we going to be more accessible to people from the immense measures of diversity? Yeah, clothing, food, immigration, religion, faith, but also neurodiversity, trauma, housing, homelessness, substance use, all harm, all these pieces that intersect with somebody, how they identify. And I love the depiction by the blue butterfly. If anybody knows, that's a symbol of children's grief and evolution through children. I love grief and bereavement because I get to support people for a year or two or three through their journey of grief and bereavement and watch them transform and evolve with support, especially as it pertains to how their personal culture changes. Because there truly is a becoming, folks. We're constantly becoming somewhat changed, transformed, evolved, broken down, reshaped, restructured as we constantly adapt to change. And that a constant adaptation to change is catalyzed in a palliative approach because of the fact of living with a life-limiting illness, caregiving, anticipatory loss, dying, death, and then grief and bereavement. And if we look at the power or the awareness of personal culture, you'll see it in caregiving. The people I support who are caregiving say, I mean, parts of me have changed. I don't see myself as I used to. So there's an experience of loss in that as the personal culture, as the person identifies himself, changes because of the tax and toll of being a caregiver. There's even living with a life-limiting illness. What are the things that are lost that I can't do anymore, that I don't identify with, that I want to shed before I die? Right? Or as I'm living with the illness, it doesn't, like the limiting part doesn't permit me to do these things that I identify as part of my personal culture. That's why it's so important sometimes. Like that gentleman, when I was sitting with who are teachers with Norman, he's like, who am I now? Or this individual whose wife's going to die of a brain tumor. Who am I now? Or the husband that his husband died. And he's like, well, you know what? I want to keep all these pieces because I'm going to tell you about the personal culture of my husband who died. That's one of those powerful aspects of even grief and bereavement support from a palliative approach, is that they teach us about the personal culture of the person who's died. That's a legacy. That's not being forgotten. That's a form of grief support. Folks, even in active dying, even in how somebody is memorialized, or in how they want to be remembered, or I love in hospital care, we have, the procession, right? And how they dress and how, as June said, she said, this is how I want to die. Okay, I'm independent. I want to die in this place. I want to die like this, and don't do a funeral. I also recognize there's a personal culture and an anticipatory loss that relates to the person's experience of losing aspects of themselves and redefining who they are because the illness prevents them from doing and being things. Or in the loss, the person who's providing care for or in a relationship with in some measure, and the loss is their experience, and that's changing their personal culture. And it goes without saying, folks, the whole aspect of grief and bereavement is filled with personal culture. Who am I? How am I? What am I losing? What have I lost? How does it redefine me? How am I transformed? So we need a culturally humble approach to align and acknowledge personal culture. Because what we're trying to do, folks, is embrace the individual, really, in not just embrace the individual. There's a mindfulness practice is embrace the individual here and now. There's a practice I got to had the absolute privilege of learning at the Zen Hospice Project in California, folks. They call it the entering. And basically what they have are it's a beautiful, unfortunately, it's not a palliative center anymore. It got sold, but they still have Laguna Hospital, which is a palliative care unit. But outside each person's room, I went down and studied with them. Outside each person's room were these two footprints. And these two footprints I would watch. They allowed me, to sit and observe. The nurses, the physicians, the volunteers, the social workers would go to somebody's room, stop, literally for 3 or 4 seconds, and then step into somebody's space. Then they'd come back out, stop, okay, at another person's room or outside the nursing station, take a breath or not. I never saw them do a mindfulness grounding practice. They just stopped for a second, and then they stepped into somewhere else, right? It literally took 3 or 4 seconds each time. And then when I asked the staff and the leadership, I said, I hear all the time, people don't have time to do that kind of practice. I said, how long does that take extra in a day? He says, maybe 10 minutes. But what he also said is that it lowered, their sick rate. It lowered their need for decompression when they got home. They were microdosing their nervous systems all day. But what do you think they were doing from a personal culture perspective? What do you think that practice does to our personal culture as care providers? What are your thoughts? What do you think they were doing besides lowering their nervous system, lowering their fight or flight, grounding, whatever you think? What do you think it does to their personal culture? Because I asked them, what do you think it does to their sense of personhood or to their own transformation and evolution through the work? Any thoughts? Amna says, sense of impact, increased melody. Says, yeah, there's an increase in awareness. Rita says, a sacred pause to remind me of the privilege to enter somebody's space. Yep. Michelle says, a better understanding of each individual. Yeah, all those are definitely on point. Sasha says, mindfulness, being in the moment. No doubt. Absolutely, Sasha. Trish says, builds empathy and compassion. April says, presence. Stephanie says, a reset to ensure you're ready to be present for that person. Amna says, housekeeping. All on point. Absolutely. And if I could sum that all up, folks, and Nina says, leave themselves outside before being with somebody else. And I'll speak to that piece, Nina. What they were actually doing, folks, also in addition to everything and they literally did in 4 or 5 seconds, microdosed over a day. What they were doing is recognizing, if not just acknowledging, and somebody said an awareness in that mindfulness practice of how they've slightly changed. What's happened? How's their bodies affected? What are they taking from one room into somebody else's room? Almost like Stephanie said, a reset, but a reset with awareness. Something has shifted in me. Something has shifted. That happens to us every single time we spend time with somebody, whether we're aware of it or not. It happens, and you just don't have to look very far from a trauma-informed approach to recognize how our nervous systems respond in different environments. Okay, that's an important piece. And I'll just speak to something. I don't completely believe that we can leave ourselves at the door when we step into somebody else's door. We can reset, we can be aware, we can be mindful, but we bring our whole presence in, right? It just depends what part of us that's coming in is actually in the forefront that we're using, that's activated. That's the practice. And that's the practice of personal culture and the practice they do at Zen Hospice Project. So with that, I ask you, what's your story? Do you know your story? Are you aware of, I mean, I didn't realize I'd experienced childhood developmental trauma until I was 42. I was like, what? Wasn't normal, And I recognized it actually with the work that I was doing with people experiencing homelessness and unhoused. I'm like, this isn't normal, feeling like this all the time and having this kind of childhood. Hey, I thought that was normal or natural. So part of the story, what is your story? What are you bringing into people's environments and lives? Where is being a learner to yourself and recognizing who and what you are affecting the care we're providing? I'm very, very conscious and self-reflected intentionally, folks, because I know I bring myself, my whole self, into every person's story, space, care, touch or not, whether I'm providing grief and bereavement support or end of life support or caregiver support. I bring my whole self. And a depiction of that, if I can share with you, is this. Does anybody recognize what this is? Does anybody know what this is? Actually, let's back that up. What do you see? When you look at this, what do you see? Yeah, definitely, Nina. You know what this is. What do you see, folks? Just observe it. What comes to your mind? What do you see? What stands out for you? Allison says a Vasily. Janice says a mosaic. Robin says a beautiful broken bowl. Nina says something beautiful. Rita says a broken bowl repaired with gold filler. Amna says a broken bowl. April says growth. Interesting, April. I would love to see, if I had more time, I'd ask you what you mean by that. Melanie says something broken, repaired in a beautiful way. All right, thank you, folks. So you see something that's been broken and repaired. Some of it's growth, some of it's beautiful, right? To use something to make that brokenness. As Nina mentioned, this is an ancient Japanese healing practice called kintsugi. Kin means golden, sugi means repair. The philosophy behind it is that which was once broken has been brought back together with intentionality with effort, with time to create something different, maybe something even new. Okay. But folks, this is my bowl. And it isn't really, although it's aesthetically pleasing and beautiful, it's actually a representation of my childhood developmental trauma. So I temper that beauty because there's a lot of pain in there. There's a lot of broken pieces in there. There's pieces I didn't want in there. I said, F this, I'm throwing them out, right? I don't want these pieces in there anymore. There's cracks that I couldn't fill, and it still bothers me to this day. And in fact, I was providing a workshop up in Gravenhurst or Barrie or somewhere like that for a bond, and I was carrying this bowl, and I tripped a little bit, and the bowl fell and broke again. After all that effort and time, and that I spent healing my bowl and putting pieces back together and then painting the lines in gold, it broke again. Now, how representative is that of life, right? So what holds these pieces together, folks, is a ceramic glue, not the gold. You know what the symbolism behind the gold is? It may look beautiful. I appreciate that, Melanie. Though I appreciate you also said a beautiful way, because I do feel the way I've engaged my experiences of trauma has been beautiful, really, right? But the bowl itself may not represent that. The gold doesn't mean it's beautiful. The gold is a self-reflection as exercise in a culturally humble approach for me to see what has transpired. It's for me to look at and say, oh, there's my broken pieces. There's the pieces that I don't want anymore. Oh, there's the crack. There's the filler. Okay. And not just that. If we truly looking at it from being a learner, if I want to teach you who and what I am, I'll just show you the bowl and speak through the bowl. Say, look, this is who I am. This is my hospice part. This is my kid. This is my experience of childhood developmental trauma. These are all the things I couldn't do. These are the things I can't do anymore because of somaticized trauma in my belly called Crohn's disease. Here, this is who I am. And folks, that being said, do you only see the brokenness, or can you see the blue? Can you see the white? Can you see the placemat? Can you see the cushion it's sitting on? Can you see the whole picture? And that's what I felt June Caldwood saw. She saw the whole picture just for that brief moment. It just felt like that. Maybe she didn't, but it felt like that to me. Because in essence, folks, that's my personal culture. All the brokenness, all the healing, all the gold, including the blue, which represents my unibrow, the white, and the context of where it sits on the placemat, i.e. the environment. That's my personal culture. In fact, let me tell you something else, folks. I've taken that same bowl. You can get it at IKEA. They're beautiful, okay? And I've lined up 5 of those bowls. And I literally, as hard as I tried, I broke each bowl and with the same energy, with the same hand hammer at the same angle. All the same culture of the bowls, right? All blue bowls with some white from IKEA, made in China. Do you think they all broke the same way? Yeah, thank you, Allison. I kind of got that. Well said. I'm glad you clarified. Do you think they all broke the same way, folks? They're all the same culture, i.e. the same culture. Do you think they all broke the same way? What do you think? Absolutely not. You're right, Robin. They all broke differently. They all had their personal culture as defined by all the things we spoke to: trauma, life, education, social media, our DNA, right? How we identify our minds, the way we think. And that's an important aspect of a culturally humble approach. Because in essence, folks, we're a bunch of broken bowls serving a bunch of other broken bowls in some measure of healing, repair, woundedness, trauma. You know, this is a workshop I did facilitated out in Calgary. And you look at it, you know, like the person up at the right had lost a limb, but she carried it with her. That piece is still carried with her. So if it's lost that piece, is it still a bowl? Meaning, does she still define herself as what is supposed to be defined as a functionality, or can her function change? And that's the whole AOTA accessibility movement. The person down at the bottom has a hole in there because they lost a child. The person on the right with that small hole in there is a person that had a miscarriage. They all work in death care, nurses, PSWs, social workers, and had a miscarriage. And she said, well, you know what? That hole is never going to be filled. I have 3 other kids, but that person, that miscarriage is always going to define an aspect of my being from a grief perspective. And that's the bowl I serve with, Rami. So that's why, folks, I'm not completely convinced that we leave our aspects of our bowls at home. You know, the great Charles Bosk talked about spaceship ethics. Like we jump on the spaceship from our home and we go to our work as if it's implanted away, and we provide care, and then we jump back on that spaceship and come back as if nothing touches us. And in fact, it completely infuses us. The self-reflection is culture humility turned back on us to become learners of ourselves, of how the work affects us. Awesome, folks. I still have enough time to show you this video. I'd love to show you. It's a music video that I did during COVID. We were mindful of precautions and what have you. I was approached by this group called Cypher, and they had some amazing musicians like Gerald the Young, Junior T, Biff Naked. You'll see them in this music video, and it's facilitated by Asante Houghton, who is the coolest cat I've ever met. And it's a reflection and a story that they took from me when I was maybe 20 years ago, when I was still a hospice volunteer, and they put it to rhyme, spoken word, and music, and it just helps to provide a different avenue with which to share knowledge and bring awareness to a palliative approach. Let me know if you can hear it. I'm just going to try to play it, okay?
Back to Cypher, the show that takes caregiving stories and turns them into songs. In this episode, we collaborate with Junior T, Jarrell the Young, and...
Can you hear it okay?
Yes.
Oh, awesome. Okay.
And
Me.
Junior was recently shortlisted for this year's Polaris Music Prize, and he's Jesse Reyes' tour DJ.
And Jarrell is a multi-platinum producer who's worked with Fall Out Boy, David Guetta, and he's just dropped a solo project.
so let's check it out. Ready? Dying is hard to talk about. But as caregivers, we need to have these conversations. And our friend Rami thought we could learn from a past client that he referred to as Alka.
How does it go?
Bring it back to the top.
Alka is a pharmacist assistant. She had trained overseas, came here, and had to overcome a lot of racism.
Rami's assigned to try and help Alka, who's working full-time, running her household, and trying to help her dad. She's drowning.
To surrender his care to someone else doesn't fit her cultural values.
That's just not how they do things.
She couldn't do it.
Nah, bro.
So what about us?
My mom was also a caregiver.
My dad, he was in palliative care.
I've had a number of family members pass away.
Mental health challenges have come and gone throughout my entire career.
Each of us relate to this story in unique ways. But bottom line, we all relate to it.
So many ways to say the same message.
Watching my hero fall apart while my babies grow. Weight of the world on my shoulders trying to break me slow.
Maybe pitch down.
I'm with that.
She says, I'm feeling really sad, but at the same time angry.
It just feels so deeply unfair.
Death does not always come quickly.
She said, I feel he's died before he's died.
You're almost like paralyzed.
Am I going crazy?
You're so underprepared for that actual goodbye. It's exhausting.
And I'm losing the time, losing my prime. When you get used to this life, who wouldn't cry? I'm losing my mind.
And I say, no, Alka, you're not going crazy. You're a caregiver that's burnt out, and the anticipation of death can create feelings before he's died.
I never really thought that you could grieve before someone died.
And that's like a lot of energy to give.
I'm learning so much.
Aspects of mental health start to creep in, right? Depression, anxiety, low sex drive, sleeplessness.
Some things never change when emotions need expressing. Trust is to be gained. It's hard to be this strong when every day words can't express the love underneath the pain.
Leading up to his death, the potency of her emotion became stronger and stronger.
Is this the moment we've been dreading?
And I said, Alka, Raj asked me a very challenging question.
This is the moment we've been waiting for.
I told her that he asked me, is this what it feels like to die?
The curtain falls and all the lights come on in the hall. Oh, we loved it and now it's over. Raise the glass and have a toast up. Walking, laughing round this beer. Loving, losing, now we're here. What a beautiful day to die. What a beautiful way to say goodbye.
Damn. And she broke down. And she was in full anticipatory grief. But there was a moment, she talked, a moment of stillness where it was just him and her. His breath slowed down. He died in her arms. And then she just held him.
No more pain, no more sorrow, no more moments to exchange. Feel these feelings throughout me. Tomorrow won't be the same. No more pain, no more sorrow, no more moments to explain. Though I feel you around me, I won't forget, no regrets. So goodbye till we meet again.
When I saw Elka, there wasn't much tears. She said, you know, because I had the chance to feel my feelings, Rami. At the end, the grief wasn't as complicated or as harbored.
Today, we share some deeply personal feelings about caregiving for someone who's dying.
Good grief, it's the good grief.
And we came out the other side stronger.
It actually changed the entire song.
Yeah, that's it.
Can you sing it again if you don't mind?
Yeah.
So goodbye till we meet again. So goodbye till we meet again.
Nobody presents it like this. This can help break down the barriers. Life's work, man. To be able to be a part of this, you know, I got touched.
They were a great bunch to work with, folks, and I love showing that. I mean, that's a story, and that I shared from an experience like 25 years ago, and how we can use different mediums and different aspects of diversity and song and spoken word and what have you to talk about a palliative approach and how it pertains to diversity. Anyways, if you want to check out some more videos, and there's some this is a great zero resource. It's called Stories for Caregivers. It's funded by the TELUS Fund, and Cypher's done some amazing work on there. There's another great one with Jen Arden. Really powerful stuff, folks. And if you want references when you receive these slides, by all means, there's lots of good references and books and what have you. I'll also provide a resource list to you, Stephanie and May, so you're welcome to share that with the fine folks. And folks, just finally, you know why I really do this work? I just want to tell you, I have Crohn's disease. The likelihoods and bowel obstructions and likelihood it will kill me one day is pretty high. But above and beyond that, I might not be around, or likely might not be around to care for this kid, right? That's my kid. And so I'm trying to share as much knowledge about personhood and trauma-informed and anti-oppressive, because the likelihood of her living with a life-limiting illness and dying of is probably 70 to 80%. And I want to make sure there's somebody out there prepared to take care of her. Okay. Here's my website, my information, or contact the great people of Stephanie and May. And I wish you the very best. And yeah, thank you very much.
Wow, Rami, that was amazing. Thank you so much for spending this last hour and a half with us. Really grateful. And I feel like my own personal culture may have changed throughout your presentation. And yeah, I just love so many things that you said, and the sharing of the metaphors, and that video was awesome. And that idea that, you know, to provide truly person-centered care, you have to consider personal culture. And I love that idea that it's constantly changing and in flux, and definitely makes sense when someone living with a life-limiting illness, that it would really be a magnified time, I would say, when a vulnerable time, as you said, dealing with loss and all these different changes. So excellent presentation. I thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge and your wisdom with us today. So
thanks, Stephanie. And thank you everyone for the very kind comments. It absolutely, it's always a privilege and honor to share time and space with you. And shout out to all the PPSMCs out there. You're my heroes. I mean, you're all my heroes because you're in a palliative approach. But thank you, Stephanie, for bringing me on board and to have an opportunity to speak this language.
Thank you for accepting our invitation. I am just quickly going to pop in an evaluation link into our chat box. It should actually pop up when our session ends as well, but just in case, it's there. And I was also going to quickly share our upcoming session in hopes that some of you folks might be able to join us in January, when we'll be looking at a palliative approach to care after stroke with Jessica McNulty and Jillian Runke. And that's on the 17th from 12 to 1:30 p.m. So it's been a pleasure meeting you, Rami, and thank you so much.
All right, folks.
And take good care, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Rami. That was really great.
Thanks, May. All the best, folks.
Nice to meet you. Bye-bye.